Tonight's speakers are Peg Rawes and Patrick Lynch. Let us begin with our first speaker, Dr. Peg Rawes. Peg is Senior Lecturer in Architectural History and Theory and Associate Director of Research at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL. She's author of A Rigor Rate Architects in 2007, Space Geometry and Aesthetics Through Kant and Towards Toulouse, 2008, and is currently editing Poetic Biopolitics, Political and Ethical Practices in the Arts and Humanities due out next year, and Relational Architectural Ecologies, Architecture, Nature and Subjectivity due out in June. Her talk tonight is entitled Non-Human Architectural Ecologies, so please welcome Peg Rawes.
Thank you very much. I've just been looking at this table-leg chair. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that you can all hear me. So I'm going to speak for hopefully about 30 minutes, perhaps a little bit more. And the title, as you can see, is Non-Human Architectural Ecologies. So my talk considers Harman's project in terms of concerns which I think are essential to architectural design today, in particular questions of human and non-human difference, biodiversity and ecology, questions which concern the role of architects in the built environment, socially, and also for non-human planetary survival. I'll begin by indicating some of the points that Harman makes, and then give an architectural and a philosophical response, focusing on architecture as non-human. And by looking at architecture as a discipline, first instance, we might say that it's a discipline that already has object-oriented thinking within it. For example, in a most straightforward way, perhaps the more lay-person way, we could say that it has histories of building styles, which lay out buildings and their physical expressions in terms of their material, structural, or sometimes aesthetic function. And when these are neat or simple stylistic histories, architecture tends to be presented as standalone, as discrete objects or buildings which function independently beyond the means of production and reception. And these approaches work insofar as they generate a discrete discipline or subject to object. In more informed versions which probably the majority of people who are engaged in the discipline themselves, practitioners, historians, critics, there are more complex ideas of spatiotemporal, phenomenological and conceptualizations of architecture where the value of buildings, their spaces, their materials generate original contributions to culture, where innovation is found in building design, where special spaces, forms, typologies are generated. And again, we might also argue that these do develop discrete objects in their own rights. A third version might be discussions of building science, in particular through advanced technologies for sustainable design, discussions which I think are very strong at the moment, obviously, in the discipline. For example, photovoltaic cells, renewable energies, which, in terms of the science that's used to establish these within the discipline, tend to follow strict scientific building criteria. They're by the laws of physics, and therefore are often seen for many as beyond the kind of human subjective realm. Yet when these approaches are presented as exclusively discrete or non-human, they are unsatisfactory, often reducing architecture to simple objects and products. And so many in the discipline tend to work against this in order to create richer, more complex cultural, social, political, economic and material understandings. If we agree that Harman isn't interested in these previous forms, and I don't think he is, although I do think that when he refers to critics like Clement Greenberg, it's very problematic because Greenberg's criticism is completely insufficient for dealing with the complexity of the built environment. We need to think about how to situate his work, however. And broadly, I'd say that his work, he is a critique of the history ideas which operate on the basis of the autonomous subject-focused construction of the world. And in philosophy, this is, as Joseph and as Jessica have said, Kantian-based. And in the humanities, we might also recognise it in approaches in, and also in architecture, which are sometimes phenomenological, may sometimes come from critical theory or Marxism, or may well come from social constructivist accounts of science and technology. And yet Harman wants us to think about different realities or conceptualizations or matters, which he, I think, I would say, specifically wants to be considered as non-relational. Joseph and Jessica have used the word withdrawal. I've tended to use the term discrete here. They are non-subject oriented. And they are also, with the caveat that previous philosophical attempts, despite their objectivity, work by Whitehead and Latour, have also tended to become poor partners in this effort. They've been co-opted into system circulation theories and have therefore lost their power. And so Harman turns to Heidegger as the philosopher through which to achieve this and cautions us against consciousness, culture, technological progress, which exhaust or control our environments through total theories of scientific determinism. And as a philosopher, I think Harman is therefore concerned with how to constitute realities and understands the world at large and for human worlds in a way that reflects the production of reality of this complexity in philosophical and in other conceptual orders. And as has been just mentioned, he does this along with Quentin Meillassoux and is concerned with the gaps that have developed between the arts and humanities and the sciences, especially the physical sciences, and with the production of reality as truth. And in this sense, I go along with this because I think there is a need to critique the basis of production of knowledge and its agency in reality and the production of that in architecture and for society more broadly. I agree that there are orthodoxies that have attached to some of these discourses of interconnection and complexity. However, I do differ from Harman's project in a number of ways, and I'm just going to outline those. I think that it is, I cannot agree that object-oriented philosophy is the first to achieve this. I don't agree that it's a project that totally negates relationality, and that relationality is in itself always negative, romantic, or weak endeavour. I am less convinced that object-oriented ontology is the way to retrieve historical ideas, especially, I have to say, when Harman does return in the end to a 20th century male philosopher. And I'm also sceptical that materialist philosophies are weak. So you may be sitting here thinking, what does this have to do with architecture? And I would respond by saying that I think these concerns are absolutely the heart of architecture, about its modes of production, its modes of reception, both material and immaterial, both dealing with the capital and markets to the phenomenological and material, from the constitution of architectural identity and technology, and they therefore come into the frame. And one of the ways in which I think this has become particularly active, and some of you in the audience may well be coming from this position, is in conversations about digital parametric production. And Graham Harman has written about this recently, and if any of us at the lecture he gave at the Bartlett recently, he engaged in a discussion with Patrick Schumacher in person, where Harman said that he was sceptical about the claims for the engineered, scientific, material, computational matter, the biology of this reality that parametric design claims. And I agree with him. I think it is problematic. When you look at the modes of its production, there is a failure to account for the conservative, romantic, utopian spirit in it. I think potentially you can look at work by OMA in China, where this has now become part of a communist capitalism. You can look in the theory of writers like Lars Spoybrook, who's unabashedly romantic. The sympathy of things generates a teleology of the 19th century of nature and science into contemporary metaphorical genetic computational code. So I want to focus my discussion by offering some other alternative, non-human architectural modes of thinking, making and practice, which are important to the built environment as well, but sometimes left out of these debates, I think. So I'm going to go through a discussion where I'm going to present these in conversation about substance, a metaphysical project, one that is concerned with environmental and ecological issues of design and build, a historical project retrieving a pre-20th century idea from the 17th century, absolute difference that is non-human and human but not anthropocentric, and also an attempt to provide a conversation about architectural ecological thinking and practice, which does challenge the conventions of subjectivity as autonomy and as conventions of humanism. So I'm offering these as a response to Harman's work. Can I have slide one, please? And I'm situating my remarks with this context of increasing global pressure for architecture to address environmental issues of sustainability, resource depletion and pollution, and the context of a digital design community which has developed a vocal set of ideas in which contemporary high-tech computational architectural design allies itself with environmental interests. We're now at a time when mathematics, geometry and computation are presented yet again as the new universal forms of innovation, but also at a time when women make up 50% of the students who train in the discipline, and yet in the UK, 11% of the profession are women. I wonder whether the seductive rhetoric of the digital geometrical discourses really constitute the kind of non-human diversity that we and the planet need. Does it sufficiently address the needs for nurturing non-human ecological biodiversity or the well-being of the global and local communities? So I'm going to, first part is modal non-human life. And I'm turning to the work of Baruch Spinoza, whose Ethics from 1677 provides an early modern example of an unusually ecological form of geometric thinking in which rational biodiversity questions assumption of democratic design authorship, material difference and ecological relations that the new geometric architectures claim. Two key concepts form the geometric ecology of these powers. First, Spinoza's concept of nature or substance, and secondly, his concept of conatus, or self-determining agency, which is both human and non-human. Substance is a complex ecological term because it doesn't merely designate extended material beings, structures or relations, but it is employed to construct a complex immanent biodiversity of life in nature, most irreducibly in Spinoza's concept of God as nature. And in conjunction with his other wonderfully complex concept of life, expression, substance immanently constitutes a plenitude of realities in discrete modes and scales, from the divine and the common, from the non-anthropological entity or environment, to the scale of the singular being or non-being. So I want to emphasize Spinoza's modal project rather than this idea of withdrawal, which is Harman's work. Spinoza's productive power constructs nature's diversity, its potential for change, what he calls natura naturans, and it's in various unifocal yet discrete modes of existence, natura naturata. Together, these powers generate a plenitude of ideas, bodies, and entities in the world, which some have called a kind of genetic principle. Consequently, substance is a univocal concept of biological and physical life, as well as a material, psychic, or divine manifestations, including, for our purposes here, architectural and geometric thinking and design, and in contrast to some of the contemporary mathematical and geometric modes that classify natural processes under disembodied or aontological mathematical logics. In Spinoza's natural geometry, biodiversity calibrates all entities at all scales, but not reducible to simple digit or units of computational code. As a result, human subjects and geometric figures are manifestations of nature in process, utterly unique expressions, including the specificity of trees, stones, horses, or dogs, or the diversity of physical and psychic expression in architectural ideas or designs. And this geometric ecology is therefore always concerned with diversity, not formal or material self-same relations. Non-human difference. Feminist philosophers have already convincingly shown that complex material, social, and cultural concepts of sex, mode of life, and technicities exist in art, culture, and in science, which have far-reaching value for non-anthropomorphic design agendas. They've shown that Western normative, subject-centered philosophy does not address the reality that complex other, post, or non-human, i.e. non-Anthropocene relations and subjectivities have also already always existed. These theories of sex, non-normative biological difference, are necessary for architecture. For example, when digital architecture cites biological processes as the evidence for computational production, when digital codes and scripts are identified as the new complex morphological design origins. Overwhelmingly, however, such discussions expose the primary purpose to be generation of new self-similar forms, whether they are topological rather than geometric. Diverse organic life is reduced to the self-same computational matter. And I think one of the problems about this particular mode of practice in the discipline is that it returns to some wonderful but incredibly classical scientific versions of this, for example, Darcy Wentworth Thompson's 1915 project on growth and form. In contrast, the work of Agnes, the deep ecology thinker, has identified Spinoza's work as a precursor to his project, especially for understanding the complexity of human, natural and built relations without recourse to instrumental or human-centered concepts of life. And Agnes has said of Spinoza, quote, Spinoza was heavily influenced by mechanical modes of matter, but he did not extend them to cover reality. His reality was neither mechanical, value neutral, or value empty. This cleaving into two worlds of facts and values can theoretically be overcome by placing, as Spinoza does, joys and other so-called subjective phenomena into a field of total realities. Close quotes. So Spinoza's theory of substance and nature therefore generates not only absolute diversity or alterity in all beings, whether they be men, women, trees, dogs, stones, geometric figures, etc., but in his commitment to a deep rather than shallow value-specific biodiversity, which can be interpreted as a kind of proto-sex theory of difference. Feminist philosophers Moira Gatens, Genevieve Lloyd and Rosie Bridotti have previously explored Spinoza's affirmation of otherness, and indeed, they do argue that it is a precursor to sex difference. As such, its political and materialist biodiversity is a valuable historic example where ecologies of geometry, sense, reason, ratio, and sex are reconfigured, which may have valuable consequences for contemporary architectural design. Although he doesn't explicitly describe or identify these as sex differences, i.e. he doesn't talk about gender difference in his work, complex irreducible difference is common throughout his reality. Feminist philosophy develops this sensibility in its critical analysis, not only in terms of human discussions, but also, this is the point I want to sort of draw attention to with these particular thinkers, in analysis of advanced technology, such as digital architectures, and includes the work by Donna Haraway, her sympathetic critique of advanced technology, Rosie Bridotti's digital ethics of care, Elizabeth Gross' feminist analysis of Darwin's theory of sex difference, or in Lorraine Code's socio-biological ecological thinking. If digital geometric practices continue to remain oblivious to political, material, immaterial realities, including sex non-difference, their claims for innovation are, I think, paradoxically weakened by concepts of production which are seriously out of date with the needs of all 21st century architects and their societies right across the planet. In parametric literature, there are moments of acknowledging sex difference, but it's generally just as a scientific biological material, rather than as a more radical biopolitical matter. Greg Lynn's Introduction to Folding and Architecture acknowledges that there is a shift from asexual reproduction of simple machines to sexual production of intimate machines. Lars Spoybrook acknowledges sex difference in Ruskin's critique of Darwin's theory, but he restricts it to a discussion of beauty. Thus, in these brief discussions, there's little evidence that it's been actualized into a real other origin of self-determining agency or reality in digital architectures, practitioners, cultures, or artifacts. 3. Non-human advanced technology. The architectural historian Antoine Picon has also skeptically noted whether the power invested in these new digital processes really is new, effective, or even desirable for meeting the challenges that face the architectural disciplines in the planet today. His discussion also connects with my concern that parametricism repeats a long tradition of disembodied, neutral, or unsexed reason. Picon's argument opens up a much-needed space to ask if another ecology of geometric relations or realities is possible. However, whilst his critique of the relationship between geometry, proportion, God and nature, and sustainability certainly reflects the key constituents in Spinoza's geometric ecology, I think that Spinoza's concept of divine immanence is actually more radical than Picon's. And this is because Spinoza has a much more a much deeper and much richer sense of an ethics of duration in how this reality is constituted. Nevertheless, Picon's discussion reflects issues which some of the feminist theories of relations opposing the possibility that ecology and technology can exist together, and relying upon essentialist divisions between human sense as female versus non-human reason as exclusively male, and therefore always negative. And in this formulation, sex ecologies are effectively consigned permanently to understand ecology as anti-reason. Without addressing these schisms, feminist architects, male and female, will continue to be consigned to a-technological realms, rather than offering alternative notions of sex technicities. And the issue of ubiquitous technology versus the political, self-directed agency of the subject in environmentally responsive architecture has also been clearly established since the UN's 1987 Brundtland Report prioritised economic sustainability, enabling the architectural marketplace to generate sustainable development through anthropomorphically driven, shallow or instrumentalised technological remediation. Feminist discussions of nature and architecture, which continue to view technology as always damagingly instrumental or alienating to society, also tend to perpetuate this exclusive split. So Spinoza's thinking resists some of these reductions of difference to simple human-centred, anthropomorphic or instrumental understandings of nature and otherness. And in the ethics, geometric ecology might even be understood as sex technicity. Its physical and its psychic biological states of differentiation generate ecological biodiversity in the individual, in the society, in the non-human environment, and in contemporary architectural design processes. Can I have the next slide, please? So apologies for this very shameful self-advertising, but I've put it up actually because of having Agnes Denes' image on the front cover. I haven't been able to get copyright permission from Agnes for this particular talk, so I'm going to move on to a blank screen rather than have that image in front of you. I'm now going to talk a bit about Agnes Denes' work in non-human architectural ecology. So on the 1st of May 1982, the conceptual and environmental artist Agnes Denes began planting the first furrow of a wheeled of feet in a 2-acre landfill site in Battery Park, Manhattan. Over the next 2 months, together with 2 assistants and a small group of volunteers, Denes cultivated and harvested a crop of wheat that has continued to resonate over the past 30 years as a potent image of complex relationship between environmental resources, urbanism, architectural and spatial practices, so much so that it's an image that has been reproduced in much of the environmental ecological literature, most recently in the Ecological Urbanism from Harvard, which interestingly don't cite her, don't credit her for this. It's just there as a nice silent image. So Wheatfield's now iconically globally disseminated image of the artist on the site in front of the then intact Twin Towers highlights the complex implication of built social and environmental relations that form the modern 21st century globalized planet and increasingly urbanized environments. In particular, Denes's spatio-temporal ecology sought to raise questions about these global trades in economics, foods, and waste relations. Issues which are even more at stake today, given the recent collapses in global finance and regulation, the impact of climate-based and tectonic disasters in developing and newly developing urban regions, and rising social and political tensions over access to energy resources. While Denes has not been naive about the idealism housed in her work, she's also insisted upon its critique of New York as one of the leading sites of integrated globalized technology and economics, and her 1968 ecologic demand to think globally but act independently. And I think it's interesting for people who deal with ecological thinking through the work of someone like Guattari that her concept of ecologic predates his by some 30 years. So thus, while producing a self-consciously golden moment of horizontal ecology at the foot of the vertical field of Manhattan's financial district, Wheatfield still inhabits a multivalent currency in ecological discourses, employing an environmental critique of the pathology housed in advanced capitalist urbanism, together with a positive, alternative political imaginary or ecology. Can I have slide 4, please? This is another piece of work by Agnes Denes. It's Tree Mountain, a living time capsule from 92 to 96. I'm going to ask you to move on the slide. Funded by the Finnish government as its contribution to World Environment Day at the 1992 Rio Summit, Tree Mountain is a forest of silver fir planted in a spiralling geometric pattern in a disused quarry site outside Lohjavi in Finland. Denes has described how she intended the spiralling growth of this protected aesthetic ecosystem to register the change in ecological and artistic climates during its anthropomorphic and also its non-anthropomorphic lifespans. And she talks very specifically about it having a non-anthropomorphic duration. Both the mathematical geometry used to cultivate this ecological habitat and the material substance of the work, the trees and the land, have recognisably seen as anthropomorphic but also as non-anthropomorphic. But the value placed on the non-human qualities of this project, I think, also recalls Spinoza's complex geometric ecology, where substance expresses both organic and non-human modes of life, as well as physical and psychic human habitats. Geometric substance, human substance, and non-human substance are here situated in what might be called a natural geometry. We can therefore suggest that this natural geometry, the silver fir, the landfill site, the participants, and the geometric configurations of Tree Mountain constitute a durational ecology. Like Spinoza's analysis of ecology, of multimodal non-human life, Denis's geometric ethics of care, a term that is used by Rosie Bridotti, reflects this multi-durational organisation in which the individual artist, participant communities, and the site itself are constructed as non-contingent singularities. Geometric thinking and practice is therefore shifted from being an instrumental technology that generates short-term economic gain or aesthetic gain to an in-process ecology that cultivates human and non-human relations of care. This technical ethics of care also inhabits a companion space with the critical intelligence of Donna Haraway's critique of advanced technologies, rerouting the role of technology away from claims for autonomous scientific objectivity into situated ethics of sex responsibility for and by all. Haraway's political imaginaries, as many of you may know, particularly her figure of the cyborg, operate at the scale of biological ontology, extending all the way up from the scale of non-human species filiation, survival and extinction, to companion species, which critique the construction of life by neutral, value-free advanced technologies. Social habits and respective habitats can only be ethically and non-exclusionary, ethical and non-exclusionary if advanced technology is situated and sexed. Denis's geometric figurations are also evidence of this critical sympathy, even though the technologies that she employs are nevertheless, I think, more modern. They're classically derived from Euclid. They don't operate on the scale of the topological conversations of geometry that we would have today. And she also has a closer affiliation with pre-modern or early modern agricultural technology. Nevertheless, there's a critique of advanced globalized and human technological relations here, but with the suggestion that other critical and sympathetic technicities may also exist. So finally, to come back to the more familiar architectural oikos, or ecologies, we might suggest that these approaches are, in fact, probably more needed now than ever with the everyday issues that we have in, for example, even in the UK, in the housing crisis, which, as you will all know, has resulted from 3 decades of a dysfunctional market-led mortgage economy, converging also with the urgent need to improve sustainable living standards in new homes. And as I'm sure many of you also know, architects are already working on these kind of problems. The RIBA's Case for Space report in 2011, CABE, and the Homes and Communities Agencies are addressing these issues to produce better, affordable, environmental and high-quality living space for society at large. And in sustainable design, literature and guidance, improving the quality of environmental sustainable architecture through formalised national standards, such as the LEED and in the US and the UK's BREEAM standards, have resulted in some mainstream professional improvements in energy-efficient buildings that use technologies such as passive ventilation, recycling low-energy, non-toxic materials, and so on. And there are others who are perhaps more in the recent history. Landscape architect Ian McHarg's analysis of complex regional ecosystems and microclimates in Design with Nature from '69 has also been helpful and has continued to help provide some more politically and environmentally responsible approaches. the environmental landscape architect Robert Thayer's bioregionist life-place theory has also informed urban designers, for example, Peter Newman and Isabella Jennings in Australia for their Melbourne principle, linking the non-human and the human in sustainable and well-governance public and private responsibilities. But the challenge remains for the profession, as I'm sure you're all aware, and for society at large, and I think also, not forgetting philosophers, is how to ethically nurture, build, and to build biodiverse, non-human ecologies in the commercial, the techno-scientific sectors, in our infrastructures across all scales. And by this I mean including the work that architects do, which feeds into the food industries, healthcare, public and governmental sectors, and in the urban public space, as well as in the local street and in the home. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Peg. We now have time for a few questions. So, anyone have a burning question? Well, I would like to ask you, in terms of how Spinoza's idea of divine substance might relate to Harman's polysyllogism. Is there a
Harman's
polysyllogism?
Mm-hmm.
And is there a way, would you be able to expand on kind of the differences or the specificity?
I think there's probably quite a bit of correspondence. The thing that I wanted to bring out, however, in Spinoza was that his concept of nature, God as nature, or substance as God, is much more than just a psychic project. I think he really is interested in the 17th century idea of nature being more than something that can be corresponding to human mind and body. And although he does talk about these two very distinct modes of the mind and the body, there is this materialism which is very strong. So I think there are some correspondences, but it'll be something perhaps it can come up in the conversation with Graham later on in the series.
Okay, thanks. Yes, question.
So I was just wondering, how do you distinguish between the human and the non-human?
How do I distinguish between, sorry?
The human and the non-human.
So I'm really using the non-human as a critical term of difference in comparison to a philosophy of humanism, or a philosophy that is dealing with the idea of the autonomous, universal subject, which is the kind of subjectivity that generally is present in much European philosophy.
So it's sort of Kantian notion of a subject as being human.
Yes. So Kant would be taken as one of the leading individuals who produced this. Heidegger is also someone who is not known for his constituting difference in his conversations of Dasein.
So given that, how does a human go about constructing the non-human?
How does a human go about constructing the non-human? I think it's more that we need to rethink the concept of the human into the non-human or the post-human. That the concept of the human is insufficient, and I've used the human today as a kind of moderated persona. But I mean, I personally do think that we need to actually rethink the concept of the human, to engage with concepts of difference in a much more real mode than the idea of subjectivity in general, or European philosophy providing the best version of subjectivity or human-centred thought.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Your use of difference and diversity seems to stand against a sort of human say, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate on, I mean, because you also use it in a very broad sense, like diversity especially. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on how that becomes a kind of political agenda or some kind of ambition we have.
Okay, so I mean, I'm using the term diversity or biodiversity because of it having a obviously an ecological set of conversations, and I'm thinking there about the work of people like Rachel Carson, of Gregory Bateson, and of Felix Guattari, whose work around thinking about political and complex forms of ecology, which are both built as well as psychic, are ones that I think are very pertinent today. And I think particularly because they deal with the idea of diversity, both from the scale of nature, or whether it's an artificial nature or whether it's a nature that might, for some people, be seen to be wholly other. But they are looking at that as well as the idea of diversity and health, mental health, physical health, social health, economic health of society at large. And I think that that is something which also does correspond with feminist philosophy project of asking more questions of the philosophical culture to become more precise about notions of difference. So those are the kind of backgrounds to it. But I do use the term biodiversity in a sense of shifting the philosophical questions or the architectural questions from notions of difference and difference to something that's more biological, actually, more material. I know that Jessica started off talking about a literary term, but I have to say I'm more interested in the kind of material formations.
Okay, I have another question. That's okay. Are there any other questions? Anyway, so my other question, which I want to ask, is if you're talking about sort of sexed geometries and potential for sex parametrics, does that take on certain formal properties? For example, how do you position that with respect to, say, more fluid, continuous forms to more discrete objects type forms, and or is that just not connected?
Yeah, I'm not interested. I mean, I'm not keen, and I wouldn't want to promote the idea of a set of formal parameters or formal kind of outcomes from talking about ideas of sex geometry. My reason to do that is to talk more about the way in which science and technology has to start taking on situated modes of production, and that does include modes of production which can relate to conversations of sexual difference. It's also I think there have been some projects in the past, and certainly the person who I've written on about sex and geometry, Lucy Rigore, has made the mistake of talking about different kind of formal shapes or the notions of certain kind of organic materializations being related more to the idea of female-centered design or thinking or experience. And I think that's a very problematic route to take. So I'm not at all suggesting in this debate, and I hope it did come across, that the idea of a feminist or a sexed agenda is one that's concerned with undoing advanced technology. It's more that advanced technology needs to engage more with those questions in order to produce more beneficial outcomes. I mean, the term that Carson used, the term that Bateson uses, is pathological. There are these issues about, there are pathologies in that architects deal with, which are economic, capital, and I think these questions need to be dealt with. And the parametric conversations, I don't think, are dealing with those at the moment. So it's more that kind of set of concerns.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, sorry.
I mean, holding on back. It seems that talking about objects comes quite close to talking about relations, especially when Harman will basically define a relation as an object, sometimes just glance from one person to an object can have some, like a tree could be an object. And that can pluralize into kind of tiny objects. Everything's an object everywhere, every contact, every glance. And it becomes a kind of relationism in itself. So I'm trying to think through what the point of the discreteness is. And I guess it's a question of degree, like as to when something becomes really discrete enough to be an object. And it seems that when a relation is defined as an object, it then takes on the property of withdrawing from both entities in the relation, and it exceeds them. And that, in Harman's argumentation, when he's criticizing Bruno Latour, is that that's where change will come from, when the relation itself actually exceeds or exhausts, is inexhaustible by the things relating. And it seems like when you refer to Spinoza's divine immanence, you've got something sort of similar. You're talking about where potentiality is coming from, and it's everywhere in nature, and that has a kind of commonality with Harman's idea of the polypsychic, that there's all these kind of withdrawn depths in nature. But it seems to come to a question of where change comes from and what potentiality is. And but to put an architectural spin on it, I think either the autonomy of the discipline or the autonomy of withdrawn spatial configurations, let's say Fred Jameson talking about heterotopias, there's always an idea that when you withdraw, there's a potentiality for change, but that it has to take on a certain kind of discrete form. So maybe to put that into question, like how would you compare your idea of Spinoza's divine immanence with this idea that there's depths in the world everywhere in a kind of polypsychic fashion?
I suppose, in the way I sort of responded to Jessica, I would say I think there is a correspondence. I think the way in which, Spinoza does have a sort of calibration quality, and it is something that does get called a life force, and in that respect it does go from the microscopic, right, or the Deleuze version would be the molecular, the different speeds, up to the large scale. But I think there's something about that it seems to me the difference maybe is that Spinoza has this concept of conatus. There is an idea of duration, there's an idea of individuation or dividuation, these modalities, which is perhaps a stronger kind of limit function than the way in which you've just expressed Harman's. It may be that the Spinoza concept of expression is actually more close to the Harman project. But again, I would say it would be interesting to hear Graham talk about it himself, because I don't think I can sort of elaborate more of a link today, actually.
Okay, well, thanks so much. There's going to be a 10-minute break, so we'll meet back here at 8 o'clock for Patrick Lynch. So thank you so much.